Today, we're going to be looking at urbanization, so the growth of cities, how cities are growing, and kind of what problems get created because of this. So, this is Unit 2, Notes number 5. So, urban opportunities. The technological boom in the 19th century contributed to the growing industrial strength of the United States and rapid urbanization or growth of cities, mostly in the Northwest and Midwest. So, we're talking about cities like New York, Boston, Chicago, Detroit. So, these big cities, Philadelphia. Most immigrants became city dwellers because cities had the cheapest and most convenient places to live. Cities also offered unskilled laborers jobs in factories. The Americanization movement was designed to assimilate people of wide ranging cultures into the dominant culture. So it's about helping people, we talk about assimilate, become more Americanized, speaking English, kind of adapting more American customs and kind of leaving behind their own cultural native customs. The social campaign was sponsored by the government. Schools provided programs to teach immigrants skills for citizenship, such as English literacy and American history and government. Between 1890 and 1910, about 200,000 African Americans moved to northern cities from the South. This is what we would refer to as a migration. So they're already here in America, but they're just now relocating to the city. So not only do we have immigrants from other countries coming to the city, but we also have this migration of people leaving kind of farms and going into the cities. So African Americans left the South in an effort to escape racial violence, economic hardship, and political oppression. So very similar to, again, why immigrants are moving to America. They want better opportunities. However, for many African Americans, they found that in northern cities, things weren't much different and they still faced discrimination and segregation. So urban problems. So lots of problems in the cities. So first we'll talk about transportation. So as urban population skyrocketed, city governments faced problems of how to provide residents with needed services and safe conditions. Innovations in mass transit allowed for larger groups of people to move along fixed routes. So some examples of mass transit at this time were streetcars. They were introduced in 1873. So you can think about a streetcar like San Francisco, a trolley type car that would be out on the street on rails, and electric subways were first introduced in 1897. And so this allowed people the flexibility to travel across the city. Mass transit networks link city neighborhoods to one another and to outlying communities. So we see a lot of these types of like subway systems in these kind of older established cities like New York and Chicago. When we think about LA, now we have a subway, but it was developed later because LA didn't start to expand until much later, more into the 1930s, 40s, 50s. So during our expansion, we have more freeways and we're more dependent on a car than mass transit. Another problem was housing. Working class families had two options for housing: live on the outskirts of cities and then take mass transit to work, or rent a cramped room in the central area of a city. Row houses were later designed as single-family dwellings that shared walls. So sometimes people call them townhomes in that sense. Immigrants would eventually take over kind of the cramped rooms that the working class families lived in and then left for row houses. But the immigrants would live there with two or three families together, so it would become a very kind of cramped and overcrowded situation. And these dwellings became known as tenements. So they're often known for being kind of unsafe and kind of poorly managed. Water and sanitation, some more issues. Cities also face the problem of supplying safe drinking water. The necessity to improve water quality to control diseases such as cholera and typhoid fever was obvious. To make city water safer, filtration was introduced in the 1870s. As cities grew, so did the challenge of keeping them clean. So when you think about the city, they're very densely populated, people living together in these um, apartments that have multiple stories. So you can just imagine how much trash would pile up, how much sewage there would be. Um, and they don't have the type of networks that we have today. There was no sewer lines, so people were just dumping sewage onto the streets. Just bath water you'd have to dump out. So it could make for a very, very dirty living condition. By 1900, many cities developed sewer lines and created sanitation departments. Crime and fire. As populations of cities increased, pickpockets and thieves flourished. New York City organized the first full-time salaried police force. The limited supply of water in many cities contributed to the menace of fires. Fires could be the most deadly thing in a city because most cities were packed with wood dwellings. So the use of candles and kerosene heaters also posed huge fire hazards. So it was only, it only took a little mistake of a candle falling over or a kerosene heater falling over to start a fire that could rage uncontrollably. Most cities only had volunteer firefighters until about 1900. The change of buildings being made of brick, stone, or concrete helped to make cities safer. So let's stop and think. What problems did city dwellers experience? And so in this picture, you can just kind of imagine just the type of trash that people would have to experience onto the streets. Here you see a dead horse with kids next to it. And so there was no trash pickup. There were no sewage lines, no running water within buildings. So until you get those things developed, you're going to have a lot of problems. People are also experiencing overcrowding in the cities, high crime rates, so just lots and lots of problems. Reformers mobilize. As problems mounted in cities, concerned Americans worked to find solutions. An early reform program was the social gospel movement. It preached salvation through service to the poor. Many reformers responded to the call to help the urban poor. A few reformers established settlement houses, community centers in slum neighborhoods that provided assistance to people in that area. Many settlement workers lived at the house so that they could learn about the problems caused by industrialization firsthand. Many of these settlement houses were run by middle-class, college-educated women. They provided educational, cultural, and social services. So within this kind of reformer movement, you really see a lot of women participating. It was kind of one of the few roles that they were able to fill in terms of being charitable, trying to advocate for the poor. Settlement houses helped to create social responsibility toward the urban poor. So let's stop and think. Why would reformers want to help the urban poor? So in this picture, kind of showing the contrast that you could possibly see in the city. You would have very rich areas, noted by kind of this building in the back, next to kind of slum neighborhoods. Maybe not this close, but this kind of gives you that idea. And so for people living in the nicer areas of the city, you may not even realize how the other half was living. And so reformers just wanted to make sure that, they're being charitable, they're trying to look out for the poor, trying to give them a leg up by helping them learn English, other skills that can help them get better, higher paying jobs. And so it's a way for them to give back. The emergence of political machines. In the late 19th century, cities experienced rapid growth under an inefficient government. Political machines, an organized group that controlled the activities of a political party, gained control of local government in major cities. The machine was organized like a pyramid. At the pyramid's base were local precinct workers and captains who tried to gain voter support in the city neighborhood and who reported to a ward boss. Ward bosses helped the poor and gained their votes by doing favors or providing services. So a political machine Their whole goal is to elect a specific candidate. So if you look at this kind of diagram here, you have voters on the bottom. And so the block captains would work in specific neighborhoods, kind of convincing the voters who they should vote for, depending on who the machine, what candidate they supported. The precinct workers and block captains reported to the board boss, and the ward boss would report to the city boss. So the city boss was not a political candidate. The city boss chose who they wanted to be on the city council or the mayor because they wanted to have control over jobs, housing, citizenship. They wanted to have kind of a say in what was going on in the government. The political machine boss. At the top of the pyramid was the city boss, who controlled the activities of the political party through the city. Precinct captains, ward bosses, and the city boss worked together to elect their candidates and guarantee the success of the machine. The city boss controlled access to municipal jobs, business licenses, and influenced the courts and other agencies. So even though the city boss was not the political candidate, he basically kind of controlled whoever the mayor was or the city council because they helped to elect them. And so this is kind of what we see as being kind of corruption in government. Immigrants and the machine. So many precinct captains and political bosses were first generation or second generation immigrants. They could speak to immigrants in their own language. The machines helped immigrants with naturalization, housing, and jobs. In return, the immigrants provided what the political bosses needed: votes. So yes, they did offer them support, but that support could also be taken away if they were not voting for the candidate or didn't do what was told to them. So you have this kind of political intimidation. Boss Tweed and Tammany Hall. So William M. Tweed, known as Boss Tweed, became the head of Tammany Hall, New York City's powerful political machine. He led the Tweed Ring, a group of corrupt politicians in defrauding the city. So an example of this and kind of how this political machine would work is that the boss Tweed, would control the jobs that would happen around the city, maybe construction jobs. So if a new courthouse was going to be built, he would pick which construction company would do the job. And so the job would only cost maybe $3 million, but they would charge $13 million. So that would be what taxes, the taxpayers are paying for this. So the people are paying for this. But only $3 million is going to the actual cost of the construction. The other $10 million is going into bribes and going out to other people within the political machine to make them rich. So that is corruption. Thomas Nast, a political cartoonist, helped to arouse public outrage against Tammany Hall. The Tweed Ring was finally broken in 1871, and Tweed was sentenced to 12 years in jail. So this cartoon is an example of one that Thomas Nast would have created. And so you see the hand, the cufflink says William N. Tweed, and that New York City is under his thumb, that he is controlling everything. So again, political cartoons are able to kind of have a point of view and share that. And these would have been published in the newspaper. And so began to help to expose what Boss Tweed was actually doing in the city. So let's stop and think. How did immigrants and migration affect urbanization? So this is a great chart. So you have all of these people moving to the city for their purposes of trying to gain new opportunities, new work, jobs. And so that then leads to urbanization. You have growth of cities, you have city services stretched to their limit, you begin to see reformers trying to fix these urban problems. And on the flip side, with politics, you begin to see politicians using this kind of rapid growth of cities to their advantage in a corrupt way. And then we will talk about ways in which that politics begin to be reformed in this era as well later on. So that's the end of the notes. Make sure you go through and do your key terms in your weekly agenda.